All right. Welcome to the Octane Community Stand-Up for June. Apologies, I had to move this meeting a week later because of Microsoft Build, which I attended last week. Um, give you a few observations about Build and then the standard agenda for going through some of the Octane updates. So yeah, Microsoft Build was last week. It was in San Francisco. Build is usually a developer-focused event. At least that's what it's traditionally been, and it's a much smaller event. So I think the number of attendees was 2,500 in person, which is obviously much different than Microsoft Ignite, which I attended last fall, and that had like 17,000, I think, attendees. So Build is much smaller, much more developer focused. I think a lot of people go to Build more to hear about the announcements about what's coming, what Microsoft is going to be releasing soon. And this, of course, this Build had a very extensive keynote done by Satya, which I think was like a 3-hour keynote with a lot of different guests that participated. There was a lot of announcements that were in that keynote of things that Microsoft is focused on. Some examples are, well, of course, almost everything had some like focus on AI, I guess you would say, either just like traditional AI or agentic AI. But some of the bigger announcements were that Microsoft is collaborating with NVIDIA on some new hardware devices. One of them is a laptop, and one of them is more of a server. And these would be devices that are super high powered, capable of running like large language models locally, which would basically mean that you wouldn't have to use cloud for AI if you're using these devices. They have like 128 gigs of RAM. Like they have GPU, CPU, TPU all on board, right? These are like some pretty high-end devices. They didn't reveal how much those devices are going to cost, but I'm guessing that they'll be between like 5 and 10,000 US, right, for a capable enough device that you could run like AI training locally. So that was kind of interesting because I thought it was interesting because Microsoft has put a lot of focus on building out their cloud AI capabilities through Copilot and some of their other offerings, and that's clearly how they make a lot of their revenue. And so it was interesting that they're going to have this alternate hardware approach as well for local models. And I guess we're going to start to see more of this, probably because the cost of cloud AI services is probably just going to increase over time, and people are going to be looking for more affordable options. Not saying that this hardware is going to be necessarily more affordable, but I mean, depending on the types of workloads you're running, maybe it will be. Um, there was a lot of other announcements that were made at Build about, like for example, Microsoft is also releasing some native AI models of its own. The branding around that is called Maya, so MIAI. And there was like I think 6 different models that they were releasing at Build. Some of those are focused more on like photos, some on audio, some on code, and so covering a lot of different aspects of AI. And I think the biggest focus, or at least the biggest differentiator from Microsoft perspective, are that their models they say are trained on a cleaner set of training data than what some of the other sort of large frontier AI models are trained on. And so that could be more attractive for some enterprise clients that are concerned about, the training data that was used in certain AI models. So that was another big announcement. It's also because Microsoft no longer has an exclusive agreement with OpenAI, so it makes sense that they have at least some of their own models that they can share with their clients, because otherwise they just become a middleman, right? And they're can only provide AI models that are provided by other companies. So um, I think the only other thing that I guess I noticed at Build is that the messaging, and this isn't just actually a Microsoft problem, but more of like an industry problem in general, but the messaging around AI is quite disconnected from the reality of what's actually happening. Um, Meaning that like there was like basically 100% focus on, futuristic AI use, agentic AI use, but I would say a good portion of the attendees at the conference are developers who are still doing development using traditional methodology, right? They wanted to go to the conference to learn about SQL Server, about Visual Studio, about .NET Core, and there was like nothing that was shared at Build that was specific to those technologies. So, like I said, like the messaging seems to be so future focused that it's a little disconnected with the reality of what actually developers are building currently. And I think that was frustrating to a lot of the attendees because they went to the event, paid for it, and didn't necessarily get the value that they were hoping for. Of course, they learned a lot about what's coming with AI, but that's not the only thing that they were looking for by going to Build. So, anyways, it was interesting that there's this disconnect. All right, so moving on to Octane and some of the release updates. So the 10.2 release was released on May 29th. And that was a longer, I guess, release cycle than what we've normally had. Usually we were releasing software every month, and this was essentially a 2-month release cycle. There were some reasons for that, which I'll explain as we go further along here. The 10.2 release had 60 pull requests, 118 commits, and there was contributions by 7 different people. And the list of contributors is included below. So a lot of actually good contributions in the 10.2 release. Obviously, the main focus of 10.2 was on this theme of scale out, and that's where the bulk of the development and enhancements went. Primarily, that was around the integration of a new caching library called Fusion Cache. I have a bunch of slides which I will go through some of the different caching aspects. But some of the other items that were included in 10.2, which were notable, were a community member actually kind of went through the effort of figuring out how to get Docker to work with Octane in a very certain specific configuration. There was a repo that was created for this, Octane.framework. No, what is it? Octane.docker, I think is what it's called. But anyway, it has a whole set of instructions for how to set up Docker. And then there were some code changes that were required in Octane itself to actually support this. The primary one was around the ability to have an external app settings. So what we called an app settings.override.json file that can actually live in a different location than the framework itself. And that was somewhat important, I guess, to get the Docker support working. I know that there's been a lot of different folks that have asked about Docker and have tried to get Docker working with Octane. So it's actually nice that there's at least one configuration that does work now, and you can follow those instructions in that repo. Also, Octane has always supported, I guess, environment-based app settings, meaning you could have a development app settings, a production app settings. The problem was that the config manager class for doing dynamic updates and in various areas in Octane, when you change configuration, it'll actually save those settings back to the app settings file. It was not paying attention to the environment-based app settings approach. It was always saving things in a file called appsettings.json, and so that could sometimes lead to some confusion as to like why your settings weren't being accepted in the environment. Anyways, that's been fixed. An enhancement that was requested was the ability to have the IP address for the remote client saved in the event log related to any events that happen. This could be typical events of, sort of adding things, changing things, deleting things in the system, or exceptions that occur. But it's nice to have that extra context to know, what the IP address of the user was that resulted in that event um, being fired. So that's been added. Um, Also related to logging, um, in the Microsoft ecosystem, obviously Microsoft has the iLogger kind of interface, which most .NET Core applications utilize, and there's a variety of different providers that are available. For example, Steerlog is a very popular library that uses iLogger. The Azure Insights relies on iLogger for events. And so Octane has its own custom logger that emulates some of the abilities of iLogger, but it actually, because it's more of a native logging solution, it provides a lot more context about what's actually happening in the system. For example, if you log an event from the front end of the Octane UI, it knows what the page ID is, it knows what the module ID is, it knows a whole bunch of extra context that is specific to Octane, that wouldn't normally be saved in the iLogger interface. And so the native logging that's part of Octane still provides like way more value in terms of like the extra information that you're looking for, including IP address now. But if you want to integrate with an external logging provider, you can now do that by setting up what we call the broadcast, which basically um, sort of takes the summary version of a log event and will rebroadcast it to any of the iLogger providers that are registered in your system. And so in that way, you can take advantage of some of the other third-party logging solutions that are out there. Of course, like I mentioned, in the process, you'll lose some of the context because not all of that context is stored in the standard iLogger interface, but it's still quite useful for those organizations that are maybe using, Azure Insights or other types of logging tools and want that data to be aggregated somewhere. Um, there was a problem with the language switcher component in 10.1.2. Basically, the cookie wouldn't be set properly if you were using the more traditional localization approach, like not the new content localization capability that was added in 10.1. That's been fixed. Took the opportunity in 10.2 to also disable certain options that are part of the framework by default. For example, Swagger up until this point was always enabled by default. That's not always what people want, or they're not even aware that it's enabled by default. And when you spin up a new installation, obviously you don't always want people to be able to access your API directly, which is what Swagger allows people to do. Well, that only if, of course, they have like a user account that allows them to do so. But either way, it's now disabled by default and can be enabled in the system info area. The capture broken URL capability it is an extra feature that's sort of related to 404 handling. So if there's a broken link in your site, the system can automatically capture that broken URL and store it so that later you can see a list of all of the broken URLs and how often they've been requested, things like that. The problem that's happened more recently, I think ever since Gen AI came out, is there's a lot more kind of, I guess I would call malicious crawlers that are, roaming the internet, and they are maybe trying to be a little bit more intelligent than the traditional crawlers were, where they try to guess at various URL patterns, usually probably maliciously to try and break into your system. But that generates a whole lot more, 404 errors and broken links. And so the broken URL log can become very full, very fast in recent months. And so now, because this was more of a diagnostic tool, it makes sense that it's disabled by default. And if you, of course, want to capture information about the broken URLs in your system, you can enable it periodically to capture that information. 10.2 was also updated to the latest .NET SDK 10.08. I think 10.1 was based on 10.06. So there's, I think, a couple of incremental SDK releases that have happened, and some of those had security vulnerabilities. So it's always important to, of course, upgrade to the latest version of .NET. And so you get that latest version by upgrading to Oqtane 10.2. As mentioned before, the main theme for Oqtane 10.2 was scale out, and this was based on a kind of specific scale out architecture where you would have, shared storage where the application was stored. You'd have, of course, a database where all of the content is stored in configuration. And then you can have multiple web instances to scale out the capabilities of the system. There are a number of different advantages of using this particular architectural approach, and there was a number of challenges that had to be overcome because Oqtane wasn't architected with scale out in mind. And so that was primarily where most of the enhancements to 10.2, where they had to be implemented, was around these challenge areas. So we talked about this before, .NET caching. Oqtane had previously used memory cache, which was, an in-process cache that is not meant for scale-out scenarios. .NET also offers distributed cache, but that's not a great fit for Oqtane because it requires you to actually set up an additional piece of infrastructure for doing distributed caching, which is not needed in all cases. Hybrid cache was another option Microsoft introduced in .NET 9. However, it also had some limitations, which didn't really support Oqtane's needs. And so Oqtane decided to move forward with Fusion Cache, which is a third-party dependency. It's a library that's been around for quite a number of years now, very robust, very extensive API, and used in a lot of mission-critical scenarios. So it seems like it's a good fit, has a lot more features than any of the offerings that are native within .NET Core. And so it seemed like a great option for Oqtane to use. Oqtane decided to not use it directly, but to create a cache manager abstraction around it to create a simpler sort of set of APIs that developers can use, and also to provide some APIs that are more specific to Oqtane's needs, meaning because Oqtane is a multi-tenant solution, then there's this aspect of tenancy which needs to be stored as part of the context for your cache items. That's not always clear to a lot of developers who are using Oqtane. And so the cache manager has some APIs which make it easier for you to create unique cache keys that are specific to the tenant that you're working within or the site you're working within. If the cache manager doesn't meet your needs, then you can still break out and use the Fusion Cache directly for certain scenarios. Caching configuration can be configured in the app settings, and it can also be managed in the system info area. And another thing about cache configuration, it automatically, so this is the caching configuration for Fusion Cache, automatically uses the installation ID that's part of an Oqtane installation as a prefix. And the reason why it does this is that so that you can actually use the same distributed cache service for multiple Oqtane installations if you want to. And so this allows you to kind of, get more out of your resources this way. And because it uses this installation ID, which is unique, as a key prefix, you'll be assured that your cache key names will never collide with one another. So just an extra benefit. Caching configuration within the system info area looks like this. So there's a new caching section where you can specify the default cache duration for items. This is the number of minutes. And so by default, it's 10, but you can change it if you want to. Obviously, by increasing it, you'll keep cache items in memory longer, which will put more load on your infrastructure in terms of the amount of memory. You could decrease it as well. It really depends on what your application needs are. Um, Fusion Cache has this notion of fail-safe, where if it cannot find like a certain cache key, or sorry, if it cannot load the factory, meaning like it cannot load data from the database or wherever else you're storing it in a certain amount of time, it actually fails over to using a previous cache value. Um, this is important in like really high traffic sites, so that basically an exception isn't thrown in those scenarios. So the cache would be stale for, a period of time, and then it will retry automatically. So failsafe is enabled by default. You can disable it if you don't want to use it. By default, distributed caching is disabled and scale out is disabled on a new installation of Oqtane. However, you can enable them. And if you enable either of these options, then you have to provide a connection string to the distributed cache, which would typically be, a Redis cache service that you're using. And then the static asset cache control is more for caching of static assets. So this is how you can control or even just view what your cache configuration is within the Oqtane application itself. This is in the system info area. So distributed caching is powerful because it actually can survive application restarts, whereas, in process caching, the memory is flushed when you restart the app. And so if you want to have a faster restart time, of course, you can take advantage of distributed caching, which will store cache information in a separate service. Your Oqtane application will restart, and it will pick up values from that distributed cache service, as opposed to getting those values from the database from scratch. So this can sort of create like a warm reload scenario, which is quite powerful. Another thing to note is that distributed caching requires serialization of the data, right, because it's being stored out of process. And so as a software developer, you have to be aware that the types of data that you're storing is actually serializable. And so there actually was a bug in 10.2, which Lee Pointer identified, and it was actually related to some cache information that was being stored that is actually a type. So system.type. System.type is a more complex type that is not serializable. And so as a result of that, if you had enabled distributed caching, it would actually, the Fusion cache would throw a serialization error because of that. And so that's been fixed in the development branch right now, and it'll be part of 10.2.1. The fix was basically to store the information as basically a list of strings as opposed to a list of types. And then of course it's completely safe because primitive types like strings and ints and bools, are all serializable. And then the framework itself can use type.getType on the string value to get the actual type, so that that happens outside of the cache. So that was the fix, and that's a typical kind of fix that you might have to do in your own code. It's just better though if you're using like if you're caching data that is stored in typical model classes. If you're just using primitive types in those classes, you won't have any issues with serialization. But one of the other changes, though, that was made in 10.2.1, so in the development branch currently, is that Fusion Cache has options around how to handle serialization errors. And so it's possible to basically set a setting, and if a serialization error occurs, it doesn't actually crash your entire site. It instead basically acts as if that the data is not cached at all, and it will call the factory method to get the data from the database or wherever it comes from. And so at least that protects your users, like in the event that maybe a third-party module, right, was never tested to use distributed caching. You enable distributed caching in your installation. Instead of it crashing outright, right, it just won't use the cache. It will continue on as if there was no cache. And so that's in 10.2.1. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but if you're doing software development using distributed caching. Microsoft has a product called Garnet, which is a great distributed cache that you can install locally in your development environment. So it installs on Windows and easy to configure. And then you can set up your local Oqtane environment to point at the Garnet service. So you just have to start running it and set the connection string, and you can use Garnet for local development. Redis Insight is another great tool if you want to actually get some insight into what kind of data is being stored in your distributed cache. This is a free tool that you can download. Again, you just provide the connection string to your local caching service, and you can basically treat it almost like a database manager where you can drill into the cache keys, see the different cache keys that were created, see the values, see the time to live on those cache items. Quite handy for local development. Web Instance ID is a environment variable that is set in the Azure environment that can uniquely identify a virtual machine. Other shared hosting environments also use this as a sort of a standard way of identifying an instance ID. So Oqtane picks up this environment variable if it's available, and it actually can store it in the event log, can store it in the job log as well, and you can view it in the system info area. And so this is very handy so that you can basically see which instance within your scaled out environment is performing certain tasks or logging errors or things of that nature. So that's been integrated. That's part of 10.2. Scheduled jobs are also kind of a critical part of Oqtane because there's often asynchronous work that needs to be done in the background. The Oqtane scheduled jobs, of course, relies on the I-hosted service interface from .NET Core. And it has its own hosted service base class, which all Oqtane scheduled jobs are meant to inherit from. The hosted service base already had sort of this scheduling capability that was part of it. And that scheduler provides some orchestration capability, meaning it registers in the system when a workload is running based on a schedule. And if another workload tries to run that same job at the same time, it'll see the flag saying that that job is already executing and it won't execute. So this sort of is almost like a locking mechanism to ensure that scheduled jobs will only run on one instance. And so in a scale in a scale out environment, the web instance IDs are not always constant because in these environments they're very dynamic. Instances can be torn down, can be spun up dynamically, which means that it doesn't make sense to basically associate a specific job to a specific web instance because that web instance could disappear at some point, which means that that job would never run, and that would be a big problem. And so instead, an enhancement was made to the scheduled jobs in 10.2 so that there's a notion of a maximum duration for any job, which is the number of minutes that a job is expected to run. And what would happen is if the scheduled job determines that it's already executing, and so which would mean that it shouldn't execute again because that means another workload is already executing it. It can then refer to this maximum duration and it can check how long has it been running. Oh, it's been running more than 30 minutes. Well, it should never run more than 30 minutes. And in that case, most likely what's happened is that job exited prematurely or something, and so it's kind of stuck in this is executing state. And in that case, because of the maximum duration, it knows that it can reset that job and actually execute it. And then allows an automated sort of restart or reset of jobs that gets stuck in this is executing state. And so this just means that, you don't have to be constantly monitoring your jobs to see if they're running properly or not. Concurrency is a big problem when it comes to scale out, because obviously you now have multiple instances of the web app that are running simultaneously. And the interesting thing is, like, if you're using Azure Scale Out, um, and you restart the app service, basically all the instances restart and start up at the exact same time, right? There is no delay between them. They start at the exact same time. And so if you have logic that is expected to kind of only run once within your environment, um, you're going to find that things execute simultaneously, which can sometimes cause problems. And this isn't just your web application. This also includes your I-hosted services or your scheduled jobs. Everything starts up simultaneously. Um, when you're using, well, not just when you're using scale out, when you're using an app service, right? When you restart an app service, the web app starts up and all of your I-hosted services, they all start up at the exact same time. And so this can sometimes be referred to as thundering herd, meaning like when all workloads start up at the exact same moment, it puts a lot of pressure on certain parts of your infrastructure, like your database. And so one of the ways to mitigate this is that you have a random delay during startup for each of these workloads. And so this has been introduced in 10.2.1. It's in the development branch right now, meaning like if when you start up, you don't necessarily need every single scheduled job to start up at the exact same time, right? It's okay if there's like a 1 second delay between some of them. And so, and even a 1 second delay makes a big difference because you can avoid having race conditions between them. And so this is important, not just in a distributed sort of scale out environment, but also in a just in a single instance environment. Another thing, so a lot of these concurrency scenarios were kind of investigated or researched further um, by running the 10.2 release in Azure in a scale out scenario. So another thing that was, of course, noted is that there is certain startup logic that's part of Oqtane that is really meant as a singleton, meaning it should only be run once. Things like database migrations, right? When you're upgrading from one Oqtane version to the next, there's database migrations that need to be run. They're meant to be run at startup, which means they're meant to be run once. But if you are in a scaled environment, they're going to be run on every single instance. That's a problem because you don't want those migrations to be run multiple times. And so that has to be carefully controlled. And so what was added in 10.2.1, which will be coming out shortly, is if you're using a distributed environment, meaning that you've set the configuration to be distributed and you've added a connection string to point at a distributed caching service, that distributed caching service can be used as a shared resource to create a lock. And so, one of the instances will acquire a lock by basically adding an item to a distributed cache. And then when the other instance tries to acquire the lock, it'll see that cache instance or that cache key already exists. So it will wait because it knows that something else is already executing those migrations. And then when the initial instance that was running the migrations is finished, it will release the lock, and then that will allow the other instance to proceed. And the logic in Oqtane is already designed so that it relies on version numbers and various things. Those would have already been updated to the latest version. It'll know not to re-execute. So this locking mechanism is important in a distributed environment. For those of you who don't use Azure or haven't played around with Azure Scale-Out, this is like a screenshot of the Azure sort of scale-out capabilities. So on the left-hand side there, you've got your app service plan. There's a scale-out option that's there. In this particular case, if you look down at the bottom, You can set the number of instances, so the instance count that are part of this app service plan. I've set it to 2, so that there's basically just 2 instances. You can set it much higher than that if you want to. You also have the ability to specify scale out methods. So in this case, I put manual, meaning I'm just going to have a constant 2 instances that are, always running. You can set it to automatic, and that means that Azure will determine, based on its sort of rules about sort of the amount of requests or the amount of CPU usage, or certain metrics. It'll determine that it needs to scale out, and it'll add additional scale out instances automatically for you. Or the last one is you can define your own custom rules, that basically that you want to scale out under very specific scenarios. So a lot of capabilities in Azure to basically set your scale out plan. And in this case, up at the top, I mean, the app service plan that I'm using in this case is like $41 a month. Because I've set it up in this way, I have 2 instances. So that means it's going to be, $41 per instance, right? So of course, as you scale out, it's going to cost more. That is obvious. And then it includes like the amount of memory and so this has maximum scale for this plan that I'm using. For this app service plan, the maximum number of instances that I can scale out to is 30. So that's a lot. A lot of instances all running simultaneously. Yeah. So when you're using distributed caching, so when you scale out, of course, you kind of need to use distributed caching because that even if you're not going to use it for the caching capabilities itself, you need a way to synchronize cache items across the different instances, so that if a cache key on one instance becomes invalidated, it needs to be that cache key needs to be invalidated in all the other instances as well. That is done via the distributed cache. And so you do need to have a distributed caching service if you're going to use scale out capabilities. And so Azure has an Azure Managed Redis service that you can enable in your Azure account. The very lowest tier that you can get is this sort of $11.50 a month tier, which gives you half a gig of caching for your application. This price is $11.52 because I have not enabled high availability. If you enable high availability, it's going to be essentially double that, but you don't necessarily need that. Even at half a gig, this Azure Managed Redis cache service will very likely be able to service many, many Oqtane installations because Oqtane doesn't, at least by default, cache a lot of data. If your modules that you're building cache a lot of data, then of course you might exceed this half gig limit more quickly, and you might not be able to share your Azure Managed Redis as much. But anyways, it's really dependent, of course, on how much you're using the cache. Folder providers are another aspect of scale out, which are not required as part of this architecture because, like the architecture which I showed earlier, uses a shared storage model, meaning like your content files are even shared because it's using a shared model and then running the web instances on top of them. However, it is still useful to be able to store files externally. If you want to store them in Azure Blob Storage or AWS, or maybe even just a different folder somewhere. So it is useful, but this feature has not been integrated yet. Ben Zhang did submit a PR that's quite a while ago now, a couple months, but it has a lot of changes that are part of it, which impact the ability for folders to serve static assets and various things. So it has not been merged into the development branch yet, and when it is merged, it's going to require some heavy review and testing. So that will still not be probably merged in 10.2.1 because it's just a very, very large PR. All right, so that covers sort of the 10.2 release, and as I mentioned, 10.2.1, which will be coming out shortly. I wanted to talk a little bit about research, R&D, research and development. And so, like, one of the reasons why there was sort of a 2-month time frame between releases for Oqtane is that I was kind of doing a little bit of philosophical questioning. I was, saying, well, basically, with the capabilities of AI as it exists now, are development frameworks even relevant anymore? Meaning, like, if you can just, tell an AI agent to build an app for me, do you really need a framework? Does a framework really provide you with much value anymore? And so during the month of May, I spent some time experimenting, using software development. I guess one of the other aspects of things is if you're only focusing on building frameworks, which has been sort of my primary focus for some time, you start to also lose touch with people who are building applications on your framework, right? You don't necessarily have the same perspective or mindset when you're building the actual framework as when you're building on top of the framework. And so I wanted to take a step back and, to kind of see what it was like to experience building an application on Oqtane as if I were a application developer. Um, and so I also wanted to experiment with different approaches for AI, which of course I've been doing over time anyways, because a lot has changed over time. And so, anyways, I ended up building a fully functional kind of application. And I used the newer Oqtane application approach as opposed to the older module development approach. And I was kind of wanting to evaluate, how quick it was to get things set up, how quick development was, and then how quick the deployment was as well. I guess sort of my conclusion on all this was that like development frameworks are still extremely relevant because if you don't use them, they can generate a lot of code, but you can't really trust that code that they create, which usually ends up in a lot of weird kind of esoteric bugs that you don't pick up on just by doing static code analysis. And then you spend a lot of your time doing debugging. Whereas if you use a development framework like Oqtane, it's already been tested by a lot of different users in different scenarios, and you can be assured that the code is high quality and works, and you're not going to be chasing your tail trying to find like strange little bugs that are, already solved as part of the framework. So, yeah, so I think development frameworks are still highly relevant if you're trying to create applications that are maintainable in the long term. They also force you to follow certain, I guess I would say, opinionated architectural approaches, which is helpful for organizing your code in a maintainable way. Whereas if you're using AI, it kind of makes a lot of those decisions for you and doesn't always create something that is maintainable, right? It'll put things in random locations, it'll combine classes, it'll duplicate code. Like it does a lot of things that a professional software developer wouldn't do. And of course, it'll run, but that doesn't make it maintainable in the long term. So yeah, I'm just going to show a little bit about this application. So this, like I said, I created this application using the Oqtane application template, right? The template that you can, basically, it's just a NuGet package, and you can basically, create a new Oqtane application based on it, and it consumes Oqtane as NuGet packages, just like a standard. Basically, it's a standard Blazor application, but it uses Oqtane as a NuGet package to provide a lot of functionality. That Oqtane application template, creates a client project, a server project, and a shared project. And in this particular case, I wasn't interested in, building an application that runs on Blazor server and on WebAssembly and Blazor hybrid and basically, every scenario. When I build Oqtane, that's the focus. It has to run everywhere. But in this particular case, I was building an application and I really wanted to just to be a static Blazor application and use Blazor server for any interactivity. And so because of that, I didn't need to use a lot of the things that were, packaged with the Oqtane application template. For example, this whole client-side service I don't need because I'm not going to be running anything client-side. Similarly, the controllers, this is the original controller that it scaffolded, but I don't need a controller because there is no essentially external API, right? It's all running on the server, so I don't need to build that out. So I can just, comment that out and ignore it. So really, all I needed to do was, build out a set of models. I also kept the service model because let's say in the future that I wanted to maybe enable this as an application that could run on WebAssembly, I would at least have all of the service models to use automatically. And then I would just need to, wire up the controllers. Um, my repositories, and then, of course, the service implementations on the server side, which I would have to implement on the client side if I actually wanted to run on something like WebAssembly. But in this case, I didn't. So I only had to implement them on the server. I have all my migrations that I created. I created a site migration. And so for those of you who, of course, don't use site migrations, they provide you with a migration capability where you can implement an up method and you can basically implement like in this particular case, right, I wanted the site that's created to have a certain name, to use a certain theme. I also wanted it to enable certain features for that site automatically without doing it manually. So a site migration allows you to do that. I wanted to set certain settings. I wanted to populate certain content. I wanted to create like pages that are standard. I also have logic in here which will remove pages as well that I don't want in my installation. So remove permissions from default pages that aren't being used, right? So you can do all this in a site migration. And that means that when you spin up the application in development, all this code is executed, and you have a fully functional application without doing any manual effort or running any scripts. Right? It's all done automatically for you. I have scheduled job that runs as part of this application as well. So like much of the capabilities that you see as part of the Oqtane framework can be implemented in your application projects. I have a set of modules, so various modules that I've built. I have some components that are specific to this application that I've included as well. I also have a theme that I built for this particular application. So all of this can, live within your Oqtane application project. And so I think I spent like maybe a couple of weeks building out this application. And essentially, so you'll notice that it says rugby in it. So my daughter plays rugby, and I wanted to build something for her so that because it's sort of rugby is kind of an underrepresented sport worldwide. There's not like a lot of great services for rugby players to kind of showcase their capabilities and which teams they played for. So basically what I built here is LinkedIn for rugby. And so if we run this application, I can point out like a few things that I did in this application, which were not difficult to do, but they're things that aren't sort of immediately available out of the box. So there I have my home page. This was scaffolded by the site migration, of course. I have some banner ads. This is a banner serving module that I built, which keeps track of impressions and clicks and all of that. If I say get started, it takes me to a login page. This login page is not the standard Oqtane login page, right? I wanted to have a custom login page where a user can enter their email and password and log in, or if they want to register, they can click register and they can just enter a name and email. In this case, it's this this registration that I wanted doesn't actually create a user account for them in the system. All it does is it emails them a link so that they can kind of follow that link and come back to the site and complete the registration process, which prevents me from getting a whole bunch of, spam user accounts created in the system, because it requires, that sort of secondary step to complete the registration process. Um, and then I also didn't really care about having a, forgot password. Instead, I'm using the send login link instead of forgot password. But, so basically I took some of the logic that was within Octane framework itself and created a custom module, as part of my Octane application to do it. So if I log in here, it will immediately take me to, so this, if you, this looks very much like LinkedIn. So this would be sort of the profile for a particular rugby player. So it's got a whole bunch of information related to them. They can, upload a photo and a background banner. They can edit the information related to sort of their demographic information, like where they're from, their nationality, um, some other information about them as a player. They can include about information, very much like LinkedIn, where you can put a bio. You can list your experience, so you can say which teams you've played for. And if you played for a team more than once, it'll kind of stack them up just like LinkedIn does. You can specify activity, meaning you can create posts, with content and photos. Um, and you can list your achievements. So basically, like, it just follows much of the capabilities that LinkedIn provides you, right? These are all if you're on LinkedIn, you kind of know this is your bio. If I click through onto one of these teams, a team is kind of synonymous with like a LinkedIn company, but a team has a page, has its own sort of team logo, background, demographic information about where it's located. You can put in about information, it lists all of the different members that are part of this team. And so their name, whether or not they're active, what position they played. Teams can have activity as well, so they can have posts, the matches that they've played against other rugby clubs, and then their achievements. And so, like, I also, of course, customized the user profile so that it shows like a little picture of a person. Click on it, takes you to your profile. Um, yeah, there's some error messages in here, but I wanted to have like an inbox kind of functionality, right, where your information is displayed, which is obviously different than what's in the box in Octane, but I'm still using the notification API that's part of Octane to do this. And you can send a message to another member. Um, and of course, behind the scenes, this is all just standard like Octane. So, but anyways, yeah, so I have like management of advertising. So, but like to build all this took a couple of weeks. And like, I would say that something like this would have taken me probably a couple of months previously. And so the big difference, um, was, oh, now I've got quite a few people here. Sorry about, switch back to here. The big difference, of course, with utilizing AI for the development. And so, um, I experimented a bit with using like, so there's a couple different ways that you can use AI currently. There's, of course, using like the automated agentic method, right? Where you kind of tell it what you would like to build and it generates a whole bunch of code. And then you review the code and fix it and whatever. And that's one product kind of way that you can make a lot of progress. The other way is to use maybe like the co-pilot methodology, which I call like AI assisted coding, where you as a software developer are still, coding, um, but our AI is basically helping you. And if, am I still sharing here or did I stop sharing?
You stopped.
Okay, sorry about that. So let's let's start sharing this again. And we go back to this, for example. Okay. And so so for me personally, I still like the AI assisted method better. Why? Because I've been doing software development a long time, and I still do not trust the automated method to kind of do what I want it to do. Usually I have a good idea in my head of what the logic should be. Um, and all I want to do is automate some of the tedious aspects of doing software development, right? So as an example, if I'm creating kind of a new feature, I'd probably have a new model that I would want to create. And how I would usually do that myself is I would, copy an existing model, paste it, change the name of it, and then magically, like the Copilot AI assisted model kind of starts making suggestions for you on, what all needs to be changed. And maybe that's not especially relevant to models, but if you're in repositories, for example, there's a lot of boilerplate code that is in repositories. Sorry, that's in the client server. Here we go. So, like if I look at like post repository, um, a lot of, so if I copy a repository class, paste it, change the name of it, and change the first word, AI is going to go through and it's going to recognize that probably that word should be changed throughout. And you just start tabbing, right? Tab, 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 tab. Boom. You're pretty much like in a minute, you're done the class. But as you're doing it, you can usually there'll be like a get might have different parameters that might be passed in this particular case as opposed to a different class. And so you can fix those as you go along. And I find that approach to be sort of more fluid for my style of development. That might not be the case for other people. Other people might like the fully agentic method, right, where it cranks out the full class of code. And then later, like it doesn't make any suggestions. You have to just review it manually yourself to see like what it's doing. But anyways, just the amount of time it took to actually build this application was probably at least 50% less than what it used to be, simply because of using AI assisted coding. And so, like, I'm sure that you're all kind of having this experience as well, or I hope you are, because like the amount of like value that you can create as a software developer has really increased. And using a framework like Octane actually just even amplifies that power even more. Um, all right, so I guess back to that was the demonstration roadmap. 10.2 came out on May 29th. Octane 10.2.1, I think I'll probably put out a release fairly soon here because the sort of optimizations that have been made around the caching, the bug I fixed that Lee found, like those things should be released fairly soon. Events upcoming next week on Wednesday is the next Trailblazer conference. It's a conference that my company has hosted now. This will be the third one. There's like 5 Microsoft speakers that'll be covering various aspects of Blazor, .NET MAUI, um, lots of AI topics. There's also quite a number of like really good .NET community speakers that'll be participating as well. So definitely you should, and it's free registration. Obviously, the sessions will be recorded and they'll be published later because it takes some time to actually go through post-production on a big event like this. But yeah, if you want to even just pick some of the events that or some of the sessions that you want to go to, you can go ahead and register. And the event should be amazing this year. Our next meeting is on July 1st. That's the first Wednesday of July. And I don't expect having to move that meeting like I did this one. So I'll try to stick with our schedule. All right, and with that, anyone who has questions, I can try to answer.
Marketplace.
Sorry,
How's
what
that
was that,
going?
Lee? What was
How's
that?
that going? Marketplace.
Marketplace has not had any updates to
Love.
it for quite some time.
Right.
And probably is like overdue. I've been distracted with, I guess, with other things, and have not gotten back to finishing off those enhancements related to that, particularly around the licensing, right?
Mm.
I'm hoping to get to that this summer.
Oh, this year then.
Yes,
That's
like yeah,
positive.
like I said, it's like overdue. So I would like to get to that like either this month or next.
Just got something to say, because a lot of people ask me on Discord and other forums. Monster is now running 10.2. So your run-up's your startups can be 10.2 now. And I'm sure as soon as 10.2.1 goes, they'll upgrade that. They took some time the last time. I don't know what was wrong with them, but I messaged them and they got 10.2 up and running quite quickly. So
Okay.
that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, Monster ASP is obviously like a really, especially a good affordable option. And they have, I mean, I really like their tooling. I was going to actually reach out to them about how they approach scale out, because I would like to know if they offer similar capabilities. I haven't
Funny you
really
were saying
explored
that
their
because
control
that's
plane.
what I'm going to do. I was going to do
Okay.
that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm sure what they offer is going to be much more affordable than Azure. It might not have
Yep.
the same bells and whistles, right? And like with, the automated scale out and all those kind of different rules based, but even if you could just specify that you want a couple instances,
Right.
that would be powerful.
Yeah. I was gonna reach out to them. I was gonna get the errors that I had first sorted out, and then approach them just to ask
Okay.
them if there's a possibility of how we can go about it. But if you want to go to them, then sure.
Okay. Yeah, because I would be surprised if they don't have some kind of a
So
capability.
would I.
Yeah.
So would I.
Okay. All right. I guess if there's no more questions, we're at time. I will publish this recording of this stand up shortly. And thank you all for joining and see you July 1st.
Great, cheers, Sean.
Yeah, thank you.